Two of the most powerful men standing next to President Bola Tinubu right now are fighting for their political survival, and Tinubu himself has said almost nothing about either fight. His vice president's name was left out of an endorsement in Gombe, and the room erupted. His Senate president has now twice in 2 years faced whispered plots to remove him from the chair, plots his own colleagues admit were real, then insist never happened. Two separate crises, one presidency staying conspicuously silent through both of them. The question isn't whether Tinubu is under pressure directly, it's whether his silence is the thing actually keeping both fires burning. If you're new here, welcome. Naija Insight Desk exists to separate the real story from the noise, especially when two stories get flattened into one online. Subscribe now because we're about to untangle exactly that. Let's separate these two stories properly because conflating them is exactly how misinformation about an APC split spreads. Story 1. Vice President Kashim Shettima. Speculation about his position on the 2027 ticket has simmered for over a year, but it reached a boiling point at an APC Northeast stakeholders meeting in Gombe. The zonal vice chairman, Mustafa Salihu, endorsed Tinubu for his second term without once mentioning Shettima's name. Supporters in the room began chanting his name in protest, and the meeting descended into a physical confrontation. Since then, the speculation has only grown. Reports of governors and National Assembly principal officers quietly positioning themselves as potential replacements, and open debate about whether the 2023 Muslim ticket should be revisited for 2027. Through it all, the presidency's actual position has been consistent. Tinubu spokesperson, Bayo Onanuga, has said the president will name his running mate only after the APC's next convention, because in a presidential system, you nominate the presidential candidate first. He's called the entire controversy a non-issue. Story 2, and it's a different one entirely. Senate President Godswill Akpabio. In October 2024 and again in November 2025, rumors surfaced of a plot among senators to remove him from the Senate presidency, not from any presidential ticket, a separate constitutional office entirely. Senator Ojuzo Kalu, a former governor, told journalists there had been real attempts, though non-successful ones, to unseat Akpabio. Within 24 hours, Senate leader Opeyemi Bamidele stood on the floor and denied it outright, calling the reports false and designed to sow confusion. Two men, two different offices, two sources of pressure. The only thing connecting them is proximity to the same president. Here's where the institutional mechanics matter, because they explain why these disputes keep resurfacing instead of resolving. On the Shettima question, Nigeria's presidential system genuinely does separate the two steps Onanuga described. A party nominates its presidential candidate first, and the running mate is a subsequent, largely personal choice by that nominee, ratified rather than contested at convention. That gives Tinubu enormous latitude to simply not answer the question for as long as he chooses, and it means every stakeholders meeting, every list of possible replacements, is speculation operating in a vacuum his own procedure permits. On the Akpabio question, removing a sitting Senate president requires a formal motion and a vote among senators, a much higher institutional bar than a social media rumor. That's precisely why, twice now, the pattern has been identical. A claim of an attempt surfaces, usually from a senator with something to gain from appearing above the fray, followed swiftly by a flaw denial from Senate leadership insisting on unity. Business Day's own analysis of the most recent round noted that Kalu's timing, positioning himself as a defender of Senate stability, coincided with his own reported ambitions for the Senate presidency in 2027, once Akpabio's tenure question resolves one way or another. Neither institution has actually broken down. What's happening is that both processes are opaque enough and both offices contested enough that rumor fills the space procedure leaves empty. Now the strategy underneath both fights, because neither is really about personal dislike. Both are about numbers and 2027. On the Shettima, the pressure isn't random. Analysts pushing for his replacement point to hard arithmetic. In 2023, the Tinubu-Shettima ticket won Shettima's own state, Borno, by a margin of just over 61,000 votes, a thin result for a running mate meant to lock down the Northeast. The argument some APC figures are making privately is that Tinubu needs a running mate who delivers larger, more certain numbers across the northeast and northwest as the opposition, Atiku's ADC, Obi's NDC, reorganizes. Countering that, other voices, including the Minister of Culture, Hannatu Musawa, have warned publicly that abandoning the Muslim-Muslim ticket entirely would create what she called an identity hurdle in a region where representation is symbolically, not just numerically, decisive. On Akpabio, the underlying tension, according to reporting on the recurring friction between him and Senate leader Bamidele, centers a struggle for influence, regional balance, and legislative autonomy, with Akpabio's visible closeness to Tinubu functioning as both his main source of authority and the main reason some colleagues resent him. In a legislature meant to check the executive, a Senate president seen as an extension of the presidency invites exactly this kind of periodic challenge. Who benefits from both fights persisting unresolved? Arguably, Tinubu himself, in the short term. As long as no formal decision is forced on either question, he keeps every faction invested in staying close to him, hoping to be rewarded rather than consolidating against him. If you've seen headlines calling this an APC split, tell me in the comments whether you think that's accurate after hearing this breakdown. I want to know if the nuance is landing.
Step back. And both stories point to the same underlying question about Nigeria's ruling party. How much internal democracy does the APC actually tolerate before 2027 versus how much is decided informally above the heads of ordinary party structures? For voters watching from outside the party, this matters less as palace intrigue and more as a signal. A ruling party this consumed by internal positioning fights is a party spending organizational energy on itself rather than on the economic pressures like fuel and food costs that most Nigerians are actually living with day to day. There's also a stability dimension worth naming plainly. Repeated unresolved rumors about removing a sitting vice president or Senate president, even when officially denied every time, normalize the idea that these offices are perpetually up for renegotiation. That's a corrosive pattern for institutional confidence, regardless of which individual eventually wins or loses either fight. Briefly, neither story has drawn significant continental or international commentary yet, and that's itself informative. Outside observers tend to focus on Nigeria's electoral and judicial institutions, not internal party jockeying, unless it produces an actual constitutional crisis. If Akpabio's question ever escalated to an actual floor vote, or if Shettima were formally and publicly dropped, that threshold would likely change quickly, given Nigeria's outsized influence on West African political stability and diaspora political engagement. Let's steelman the case that this is being overblown. On Shettima, the APC has denied the drop speculation in the strongest possible terms, calling it purely speculative, untrue, and utterly baseless, and openly warning its own officials against fueling the rumors. Onanuga's framing that no running mate decision is even due yet is procedurally accurate, not spin. It is entirely possible this entire cycle of speculation resolves with Shettima simply being renominated once the convention happens, exactly as APC officials insist. On Akpabio, both Kalu and Bamidele, despite their public disagreement about how to characterize it, ultimately affirmed the same conclusion. The Senate remains united behind his leadership, and no formal move has ever actually reached the floor. 2 years of recurring rumors that never once produced an actual motion is itself evidence that the threat may be more performative than real, a way for ambitious senators to signal presence without ever risking a vote they might lose. The nuance worth holding on to. Tinubu under pressure is the version of this story that gets clicks, but a more precise read is 2 of Tinubu's closest allies are under pressure from within the party's own ranks, while Tinubu remains procedurally and publicly above the fray. That's a less dramatic sentence, but it's the accurate one. 3 things worth watching. 1. Whether the APC's next national convention actually produces a running mate decision that keeps Shettima, replaces him, or, as has happened before, gets postponed again, extending the ambiguity further. 2. Whether the Akpabio rumors, for the first time, produce an actual floor motion rather than another round of claim and denial. That would be the real signal this has moved from rumor to institutional crisis. 3. Whether Tinubu himself ever breaks his silence on either matter directly rather than through spokespeople. A direct statement from him in either direction would immediately end the speculation cycle in a way 3 years of denials from aides have not. So, is Tinubu under pressure? Indirectly, yes. Not because either crisis is being aimed at him, but because his continued silence is the space both disputes are living in. The moment he speaks plainly on either one, most of the speculation collapses. Until he does, expect both stories to keep resurfacing roughly on schedule every time a stakeholders meeting or a Senate plenary gives them a new opening. What we haven't resolved and won't pretend to, whether that silence is deliberate strategy or simply Tinubu choosing not to spend political capital on questions that haven't forced his hand yet. Tell us which you think it is in the comments. That's genuinely the open question here. If this gave you a clearer picture than the headlines did, share it with someone still repeating the Shettima rejected version. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.